We hear a lot of perspectives on the Mankind podcast. Inclusion of a guest is not an endorsement of their views, and the opinions expressed here do not always represent the mission or values of the Mankind Project USA.
Looks like the rain has gone.
G'day and welcome to the Mankind Podcast, the show where we break the molds of modern manhood to prove that there is more than just one way to be a man. I'm your host, Brandon Clift, and today I am joined by Boyson Hodgson to help me introduce today's topic with our guest, Emiliano Diaz de Leon. Boyson, thanks for being here, mate.
You're welcome, Brandon. It's good to be with you.
So today's topic is about the impact of sexual violence on men and boys. And so first off, of course, there's a trigger warning in effect around this. Boyson had a chance to listen to the interview that I did with Emiliano. So, mate, give me an idea of your takeaways from that conversation.
Well, first, just thanks to Emiliano for being willing and bringing his experience as somebody who's worked with survivors of violence to the table. And he just has such a long history and so much experience, intimate experience with helping and supporting survivors. So thanks for that. And this is a hard one. Sexual violence against men and boys, sexual violence in general is such a difficult topic to tackle. And I think that you were super vulnerable in the conversation and really went in to listen and hear that. So yeah, I honor you for what you did, what you brought.
Thank you, man. Thank you. Yeah, it was very uncomfortable, but what I really loved about my time spent with Emiliano is just how well he does to lean in to different aspects of the topic that we covered. I purposely wanted to ask him questions that represent a lot of beliefs of certain people. Things like, do you believe in redemption of perpetrators and things like that, to really just give a bird's eye view of the kind of questions that are on people's minds around these topics, right? Because everyone's experiences are different. But I think what's quite shocking and what a lot of people aren't initially going to perhaps believe or be cognizant of is the amount of men and boys that have been impacted by sexual violence, being 1 in 6.
Yes.
And I think it's important to mention that this conversation isn't to take away from the impacts of sexual violence against girls and women and non-binary people. It isn't. It's a both and. It's about raising awareness about the acts and themselves and where people can go to seek shelter, to seek rehabilitation, to seek help. And yeah, it's full on. But also, Emiliano and I have a lot of fun as well in the process. You know, there is some lightness to it, and what I love is there's a lot of hope and a lot of progress that's underway right now.
Yeah, thank you for saying that the intent of this conversation and the way that you framed the conversation was absolutely not to take away from the impacts of sexual violence on women and girls, and to include the reality that sexual violence impacts girls and women and men and boys in different ways, and impacts us all, and impacts our communities and impacts our families. And this is something that Emiliano goes into a lot in the conversation, is that, you know, it's so uncomfortable and it's so scary and it's so easy to get into fear and denial and push that away. And it's easy to get into taboos in our beliefs about what it means to be a man, what it means, you know, who perpetrates violence, how violence impacts different people, what's available for support. Like, these are all incredibly sensitive topics to talk about. And let's talk about them.
Yes.
Yeah.
That exactly. Exactly. Let's talk about them. And so wherever you are, listeners out there, wherever you are on your journey, at whatever degree that this topic might impact you. In fact, you might even not even be aware if it impacts you at all.
Mm.
But I want you to honor where you're at right now in this stage of life, or where you are at in this moment. I.e., if you need to pause and stop listening, give it a break, come back later, please do so. And even if you personally haven't had experiences of sexual violence, even if you don't have anyone that you're aware of in your circle that has been impacted, know that there probably are people that have. And this is an opportunity to become a champion for those that have been impacted by it,
Mm-hmm.
and so that we together can help, really rise the tides on this, and support all people, so that we can prevent it as much as possible, and make it clear to those that have been impacted that there are places they can go to seek refuge, to seek support, to seek healing. So if we can normalize these kinds of conversations and talk about them, I think that's a good first step.
Beautiful. And I just want to reframe to say, listeners out there, if you have not been directly impacted by sexual violence, you know someone who has.
Mm.
You know a man who has been impacted by sexual violence as a child. You know women who have been impacted by sexual violence as a child. And we can break the taboo of keeping these, trying to hide from what is real and what impacts many, many of us in our culture.
Mm. Beautifully said, Boyson. Well, mate, thank you for being here. And you, the listener, thank you for being here for this incredible, in-depth conversation with Emiliano Diaz de Leon. Enjoy. G'day and welcome to another live recording of the Mankind Podcast, the show where we break the molds of modern manhood to prove that there's more than just one way to be a man. Now, throughout the past couple episodes, we have been talking with various experts and people of experience in many different facets of, that relate to manhood, masculinity, boyhood psychology. And it's been great to gain insights from these experts as to how we as men, boys, or all people can become champions for certain persons, certain people that have been impacted by various things in life. And a big part of the mission for the Mankind podcast is to really lean into the discomfort of courageous conversations, which means dealing with, very difficult and uncomfortable topics. And today we are going to stand in the fire with Emiliano Diaz de Leon. He's a men's engagement specialist from Texas, and he is going to share his experience and his wisdom from his, decades now of experience working with men and boys who have been impacted by sexual violence. So it has to be said at the beginning, trigger warning on this episode. Really important that whether yourself personally, someone close to you that you love, or even someone that you may not know who might have been affected by sexual violence, consider who's in the room listening with you, and just take care of yourself. Really take the time to check in and see if right now is the time to actually listen to this, because now may not be the time, but there may be a time later on. So Emiliano, I'll give you a chance, mate, to introduce yourself and we'll get underway.
Thank you, Brendan. So happy to be with you today, and I think it is appropriate because April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and I can't think of a more appropriate time to have this conversation, especially with the boys and men in your audience, right? And my name is Emiliano Diaz de Leon. I am the men's engagement specialist with the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault. We are the Sexual Assault Coalition here in Texas. We represent all of the rape crisis centers in Texas. And I've been with TASA now for 13 years, working primarily in the areas of prevention and victim advocacy. So I work with folks who are doing prevention education and providing services to victims and survivors of sexual violence throughout Texas. And then, of course, I do consulting work on these issues around the country, and I've done some work internationally. And so I'm just thrilled to be with you today, and I appreciate the trigger warning. I think it's so important for folks to just keep that in mind as you're listening to this conversation. And if you need to take a break, if you need to walk away, if you need to, um, you know, do some self-care, whatever that is for you, I want to encourage you to do that. If you need to seek support, I'll be sharing some resources where you can do that. But we want to encourage you to take care of yourself during this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you, mate. Beautiful check in there. And I think to kind of set this up and put it into context, we've seen a really great impact of movements like hashtag Me Too
Mm.
to shed light on the experience of women and girls of sexual harassment, sexual assault. And I think that with the rising of the tides in that space, I think it's very common to not even consider that there are actually men and boys who themselves are impacted by sexual violence. We were talking some of the stats before we went live. Not a lot of people know that 1 in 6 men have had an experience of sexual violence or harassment in their lives. So, mate, how common, outside of that number, how common, well, not how common is it? Why do you think that is? Why do you think that is
Mm.
that we don't commonly think about men and boys as the victims of such a thing?
Yeah. Yeah, I think for folks just to keep that in mind and think about the boys and men in your life, that you know, that you love, that you live with, that you work with, that you worship with. And 1 in 6 of those men would have had some experience of sexual violence. I think that's just a profound reality. We also know that that's the most current research that we have. So unfortunately, it may be higher than that um, because of the how difficult it is to disclose or to
Yeah.
report the abuse, right? So,
Yeah.
uh, we acknowledge that it could be potentially higher, and it's important to keep that in mind because I think you are going to encounter men from different backgrounds, different races, different ages, sexual orientation, religion, socioeconomic backgrounds, etc., um, who have had some experience of sexual violence or sexual abuse, whether it was during their childhood or as adults. And I think it's important just to acknowledge that reality, and encourage people to keep that in mind as they talk to the boys and men in their lives, right? That of that reality, that it's so important for them to be prepared to have these conversations earlier rather than later on in life. I think I'm a father. I have an 11-year-old boy, and one of the things that we collectively decided as parents is that as soon as he could begin to understand and communicate, that we would begin to have conversations in an age appropriate way, that we would begin to read books that talked about boundaries, that talked about what was appropriate and what was not appropriate in terms of touches. And so, and that's been an ongoing conversation as parents. And so that's why it's so critical for us to engage in this conversation, not just during the month of April, but all the time, right? We want to center the experiences of survivors and really listen to their stories, and acknowledge that this is a crisis in our country, that we have all of us have an opportunity to address, and ultimately our mission here at TASA is to end sexual violence, right? Whether it happens in my lifetime, I believe that it will happen, and we will be able to end sexual violence, not just in this country but around the world. But it requires sort of a collective action, an awareness, a conversation. Um, it requires funding. It requires our time and our money and all of the things that make providing those services to victims and survivors possible, so that they can heal and
Yeah.
ultimately we can work towards preventing sexual violence and sexual abuse.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think we'd be doing a disservice to the whole topic at hand if we didn't speak to, like, where does this come from? Like
Mm.
rather than speak to the symptom and find the perpetrators, lock them up and throw away the key, dust your hands off, job done. No, let's actually talk about what sets this up. So from your experience, what have you noticed have been uh, the variables or the key components that have come into the perpetrator? Like, what creates someone who's willing to perpetrate sexual violence?
Well, I think it's important for your audience to understand that sexual violence is an act of power. It's an act of control, and it's not an act of it's not a sexual act. It's an act of violence, and I think that's why our language is so critical to talk about it as a form of violence. So when I think about this issue, I tend to use sexual violence rather than sexual assault or sexual abuse, even though those are part of our terminology in terms of when we talk about this issue. So it absolutely is an act of power, right? There's nothing um, there's nothing psychological about offenders or perpetrators. Um, they can be anyone, and I think that's important for us to understand that the way that that society is structured in terms of power and oppression, in terms of patriarchy and the ideas around manhood that we have in terms of power in controlling somebody and um, having access. Uh, those all contribute to sexual violence, right? These things, these there's all these societal contributions that make sexual violence possible, and I think it's important for us to understand that anyone could abuse, and it ultimately is a choice of being able to control or to intimidate or threaten. It's also generational, unfortunately. It's important for us to understand that those folks who have been abused themselves are not necessarily going to go on to abuse themselves.
Although
There
it's
isn't,
although it's very common that those who perpetrate were once victims, or sorry, once are victims themselves, generally.
yeah, yeah. When we look at the research and the interview perpetrators and offenders, they do have their own histories of violence and abuse, including sexual violence and abuse. But I think that's not always the case, right? It's
Yeah.
difficult to identify an offender or perpetrator in our midst, right? We know, like we can look right now. I can look online and see what registered sex offenders are living in my neighborhood. Any of us can do that.
Mm.
But they're registered sex offenders. They've been accused and convicted of a crime of sexual violence, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the offenders are known to us, our neighbors, and unfortunately our family members and our friends and
Yeah.
the people that we live with, the people that we love, that we admire, that we respect. And I think that's why the issue of sexual violence is so pervasive, because it happens so close to home, right? I think people, when they think about sexual violence, they think about the rapist, the stranger. But the reality is that the person who is offending, who is abusing, tends to be somebody that we know and that we love and that we live with, right? And I think that's why it's so difficult for us um, to acknowledge that it's happening to us and even to report the abuse because of our fear of um, losing that person in our life, right? And imagine for folks who are watching, that's generally the case, that the offender was somebody that they knew. That doesn't mean that it can't happen, that strangers can't abuse, but it's situational. It's those acts of violence. Those are violent, and so they do happen. But I think the majority of sexual violence and sexual abuse is perpetrated by people that we know.
Yeah, it's close to home.
Hmm.
So there's a big part of my role is to try and ask difficult questions that may not be popular, right? Just to try and give it a well-rounded view of the whole thing. And so I am going to ask you. I'm going to ask you soon about redemption for perpetrators. But before we get to that, I want to share an anecdote, a kind of a personal experience that I witnessed. Is and I won't disclose the man's identity, of course, but a man that came into the Mankind Project and was in our men's group. He had been, having a lot of trouble in his relationship, a lot of trouble as a parent, as a father, going through a really ugly divorce. And through some of the facilitation and the work in the Mankind Project, we were able to identify that the dude was just hooked on power, just throwing his weight around. He did everything he could in the workplace, at home, with his parenting, to just throw his weight around, throw his power around to get what he wanted. What we would archetypally call either a tyrant king or a warrior savage, right? But through some bucketing and through some digging, we were actually able to get to the bottom of that. When he was 13 years old, he went out for a surf, and on his walk home, he went by the public bathrooms, and a man grabbed him and pulled him into the bathrooms and violated him.
Yeah.
And when he went home, he wouldn't tell his parents because his parents were very openly homophobic. And so he went through his teens asking himself, well, am I gay then?
Yeah.
Does this mean I'm gay if this happened to me? And when he got into later life and in positions of power, whether in his relationship or in his workplace, it's like, well, someone took my power away. I'm going to take everyone else's away. So I was F-worded, then I'm going to F-word everyone else in my life because something was taken from me. And although he never committed, to his words, never committed sexual violence to anyone else, he was doing it in other ways. He was finding other ways to throw his power around. So what are some other impacts? What are some other knock-on effects have you seen from some of the victims that you've worked with?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think folks who are watching will they have their own stories in terms of from the boys and men in their lives that have experienced a similar type of abuse, whether it was one time or ongoing. Unfortunately, offenders, the abuse can be ongoing by the same individual or multiple individuals in a family. Or and again, I think that's the most difficult thing to accept, right? But I think his response is common, is all too common amongst boys and men. And I think that's why it's really important for us to pay attention to the responses, especially changes in behavior, changes in mood, whether it's substance abuse, engaging in risky behavior, suicidal, being suicidal, engaging in healthy, unhealthy sexual behavior. So there's all these indicators that will pop up at different times for boys and men, right? And I think it's important for us as family members and friends to pay attention to that, right? To notice and to intervene when we can and however we can, because like you said, if there's not early intervention, if there's not if we're not able to surround that individual with care in terms of the support that they need, or the unconditional love or acceptance, or even the belief, it's so important that we just believe survivors. So when a boy and man tells us that this happened to them, we're like, well, what were you doing, right? We have this strong reaction because we believe, because of these ideas about masculinity, is that we have to protect ourselves. We can't let anybody hurt us. we have to be tough, and we can't let anybody take advantage of us, especially sexually and or physically. And so when it happens to us, there's a tremendous amount of shame and guilt wrapped up in that. And then when we're not believed or accused that we were responsible for the abuse, that's detrimental, right, to the victim, and to the survivor in terms of their ability to heal. Um, and wherever you are in that process, right, because it is a process, that it really is a journey. And I think it's important for folks that are watching to understand that the Mankind Project is really can be a part of the journey of healing for a lot of men, because there are not a lot of places where they can go to do that healing work, where they can begin to undo the damage that um, from these experiences, right? That are very much linked to masculinity, right? So our response to our experiences of abuse are very much linked to our ideas about manhood, and and that's why it's so painful to
Yeah.
hear to hear to hear that another boy or man that we know or love has experienced this, especially at the hands of another man, right? Which is usually the case.
Mm,
Um, so yeah.
mm. This makes me think back, of course. Have you heard of the term
Mhm.
man box? Yeah. So Tony Porter talks a lot about the man box, right? The unspoken rules
Yeah,
of the playground, right? Don't be weak. Don't show your emotions. You need to, establish power, establish strength. And I can see the
yeah,
links there, right? That if someone violates me and abuses me, then I essentially have lost
that's right.
power. I need to regain it somehow. And what has blown my mind in this work has been the amount of healing I've seen men go through around sexual
Mhm.
shame around this work. I mean, of course, there's breakthroughs
Yeah,
left and right for things that don't relate to sex at all, but the shame that men hold around sex, I think, must contribute to this as well. Whether it's pornography from an early age, thinking your penis isn't big enough, or I see how this all ties
absolutely.
in
Yeah,
right to this that men aren't the ones uh, to be abused, right? And so I want to ask you though, I th- to me, I think it's very important to validate the experience of people, regardless of the objective truth. That if their reality is telling them one thing, right, you should treat it that way. Um, have you ever seen Have you ever seen cases of people kind of crying wolf,
yeah.
that actually haven't been telling the truth, or in your experience, has it just been like unanimously people are coming in with just real cases and examples?
That's an important question. I imagine your audience is wondering the same thing. Um, the majority of cases that I've experienced as a victim advocate, and I was a victim advocate for more than 2 decades before I came to TASA. Every survivor that I encountered was a survivor of violence and abuse, right? Whether it was reported or not. I think what's so difficult for boys and men is that they don't come forward, they don't report the abuse. There's
It's,
no,
it's taboo.
yeah, partly it's because they don't, there's no evidence, right? And I think because of our criminal justice system, in terms of the way that the laws are written around sexual violence, you have to be able to prove that there was an act of sexual violence, that there was some form of penetration, and that's difficult to prove, right? If you do not immediately conduct a rape kit. So boys and men are reluctant to do that. It's much more common for children, especially if they disclose the abuse early or immediately. So I think it's important for folks to understand that when children disclose abuse, then we are all obligated to report that abuse to law enforcement and to the authorities, right? And then immediately a process begins where that evidence is collected, and preserved to eventually, to charge and convict the offender. Now, when boys and men come, like when men come forward, it's usually much later in life, right? Um, because of that, the shame, the guilt, the fear. They might not come forward until the offender has passed away, because it's a prominent family member or friend of the family. It might be somebody who is a prominent coach, um, a prominent pastor, community leader, etc. Right? So there's a tremendous amount of shame and fear of again reporting an individual, and it's even more true for individuals that are immigrants or refugees and their offenders are citizens, right? In terms of the fear of being um, detained and so there's a lot that happens, especially for men who are in detention or in jail or in prison who experience sexual violence at the hands of the people who are of the guards or other inmates, right? So there are these vast experiences of sexual violence among boys and men um, that, again, because our system is designed appropriately to respond to the majority of victims of sexual violence, which are girls and women, we have not we haven't really figured out how to design systems of support and services for boys and men, and that's a big part of the work that I do here in Texas and with other sexual assault coalitions and rape crisis centers around the country, is to help them think about, okay, so what are the critical what's the infrastructure that we have to build in order to also provide services to the boys and men in their communities, right? And so because it's just it's not common enough, right? So if you look at even if you go and look at your local reports of sexual violence and look at the gender breakdown, you're going to see that the smaller percentages of boys and men just that are reporting at your local municipal level. And so that's why it's so important for us to encourage boys and men to come forward when they are ready um, to report the abuse, right? Or to collect, to do the collection so that we can eventually hold the offender or perpetrator accountable. So yeah, it's difficult to even fathom or to even to believe, that this is happening.
I think it's also the fact that we're having this conversation is a step forward in normalizing the conversation. I love that you're
Absolutely.
speaking with your little boy about it. Just early, a very Fred Rogers approach. I like that. Very nice. I think there's a lot of hysteria right now. There's a lot of energy that's being kicked around, thrown around men's involvement in all of this. You've got some people feeling like it's just a complete painting of men, right? Broad stroking all men, that men abuse their power, throw their weight around, are the oppressors. And, what do you think are the best steps as far as helping invite versus indict men into this conversation? Like, what do you think is the best way to invite men into this conversation so that rather than say, well, I, Brandon Clift, am going to be a man who doesn't commit sexual violence, to go, no, I'm going to be a champion for those who are victims, and I'm going to be a champion to speak up against those who I believe are condemning or throwing their power. How do you think we should invite men into that conversation?
Well, I will tell you how I ended up here. And I started, I'm a survivor myself of family violence. So I grew up experiencing, witnessing all types of violence growing up, both on the street and at home, right, at school. And so that ultimately brought me to my local rape crisis center here in Austin, Texas. And when I came to the center, I came as a volunteer. I wanted to get involved. I wanted to do something. I wanted to be that change, right? And I just approached them and said, I'd really like to volunteer. I'd like to get involved in this issue. And so, just like here in most rape crisis centers around the country, volunteers are required to go through a pretty intensive training. And it was through that training that I learned how to be a victim advocate, right? How to be an ally for victims and survivors, all victims and survivors, right? and from that moment, my work transitioned from being a volunteer to eventually working as a victim advocate at the battered women's shelter here in Austin. Because it was sort of like I felt like I needed to contribute, I needed to do more, and at the time I was the first and only man working in a battered women's shelter here in Austin. In terms of their history of having a male identified person working as a victim advocate. Now, 2 decades later, that's not. There are countless number of men who are volunteers and who are working for Safe Alliance here in Austin, right? So one man can change the trajectory of the way that we think about men's role in this work, right? It just takes one man that is willing to do the work and to learn from the girls and women who have been engaged in this work much longer than me or much longer than us as a collective group, but who invited me into that space, who trained me, who mentored me. So everything that I know, everything I'm talking about is a result of of what I learned from girls and women. So I think in the process, I'm mentoring and working with other men who are now engaged in the work, right? So there's this sort of growing group of men, these champions for change, right, that you were talking about, that are engaged both in the prevention side and the victim advocacy side. The more that we invite men into this space to work with victims and survivors, um, one of the things that we realize is the impact that has, not just on victims and survivors, that there are good, healthy, nonviolent, loving, nurturing, etc. men, right, in their community, who are allies. And I think that's why just getting involved, whether it's donating or volunteering or just showing up, just believing survivors in your life, and making sure that when we talk about sexual violence, that our language is inclusive of all kinds of people, and that's why it's so important for us to talk about like men and male identified folks and transgender men and boys who experience sexual violence as well. Like we need to open up that, like, our broaden our discussions around sexual violence so that men feel like they have a space in this dialogue, right, in this discussion. And I think that's why this conversation is so critical.
Yeah.
Um,
So it's almost like we're speaking about the act, the problem, the impacts, the solution, and hopefully trying to remove the association that sexual violence equals a man did it.
Sure.
We're actually just speaking to the act itself and getting people on the path to healing.
Yeah, I'm more concerned. Honestly, I think I'm more concerned about the victim and survivor than the offender or perpetrator. I think while our work is critical and important, the needs of male survivors is just as important, right? It's not. I think it's important for your audience to understand to me, there's no distinction in terms of the needs of boys and men who experience sexual violence from the needs of girls and women, right? Now, the way that we provide services, the way that we think about talking about this issue has to be different, because the approach is going to be different.
Yeah.
And the services will look different, but everyone who is watching needs to understand that boys and men have the same access to services that girls and women do, right? In every community, there's a rape crisis center. And so it's critically important that you get involved, that you support, that you learn as much as you can about their work, so that when you do encounter a survivor in your life, male or female, regardless of their gender or their identity, that you're able to refer them, you're able to go with them, accompany them, or to refer them to the local rape crisis center. Because that's an important place for boys and men to heal, and to get the assistance that they need to start the process of reporting the abuse, or just doing the healing work, the therapy of addressing their experiences of violence.
This was the end of part 1 of my discussion with Emiliano Diaz de Leon. So to hear part 2 of this recording, go to the next episode in your podcast player.